Morning, how are you? कैसे हैं आप लोग? Well, children, in the last class we saw that the regarding the self incompatibility. So do you remember what is self incompatibility? Self incompatibility is nothing but the inability of the stigma to accept the pollen. What is the reason? You should know the concept, isn't it? Because they have the similar alleles. Very good. So today's class we are studying the pollen pistil interaction and what is the further processes that is happening after this pollen pistil interaction. Well, children, the pollen pistil interaction, it is nothing but the acceptance of the compatible. Now you see that is compatible pollen by the stigma. Well, so once that is accepted by the stigma, then the further process that is moves that proceeds is nothing but the fertilization. So you know very well, you can just recall from your 10th standard what is we have studied the reproduction chapter there. So fertilization is nothing but the fusion of the male gametes with the specific cells in the embryo sac. So because we are in the higher classes, so we are proceeding to this particular thing. Well, children, let's proceed now. Well, now what is the things that you will be knowing here? The learning objectives that is supposed to be known for you is to apply the previous knowledge to learn this topic, to enable to understand the pollen-pistil interaction only in compatibility, compare the role of two male gametes in the fertilization process, and the skill of drawing the structure of ovule depicting double fertilization. Well, children, next one. Now we are entering into the stages. What are the events of pollen-pistil interaction? How do they proceed? So here the various steps that is there is nothing but first is you can see that there is the landing of the true pollen on the compatible pistil. Next is the germination of the pollen and the formation of the pollen tube where the pollen grains release its contents. The third one is the pollen tube growth through the style of the pistil towards the ovary. The next one is the entry of the male gametes into the ovule and then through the synergate. So these all we have studied in the earlier things before starting of this chapter, that is sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So we saw that how the microsporogenesis and megasporogenesis was occurring. So just you have to recollect all those things, right? Now keep that in mind. The rest one. So these are the steps, my dear children. That is, first is pollination. That's what is nothing but transfer of the pollen from the anther to the stigma, right? Of the same flower or a different flower of the same plant or a different plants of the same species, right? This is the pollination. Pollen adhesion. That means there is some attraction with this pollen with the receptacle of the pistil. What is the receptacle of the pistil? That's nothing but stigma. Then due to that, there is a pollen hydration will occur and then pollen germination will proceed. After that, the pollen tube will enter through the stigma and then the pollen tube growth through the style and further the pollen tube entry into the ovule and then subsequently into the embryo sac and then eventually giving rise to the double fertilization. Well, children, next one. When the right pollen lands on the receptacle, so you should know that that is a very important thing is when the right pollen lands on the receptacle of the pistil. The receptacle of the pistil is nothing but here the stigma. Now let us see this. You can observe this picture here. Now you can see that this is the completely the gynoecium and this is you see the andrecium, right? So you know already you are familiar with it. So what is it tells? Through this compatible, well, that is very, very important. Through this compatible, isn't it? Through the compatible pollen grains, the pollen grain germinates on the stigma. Is it clear? The pollen grain germinates on the stigma to produce a pollen tube through one of the germ pores. So the pollen grains you can see here, they are resting on the stigma and then stigma accepts it and then the contents of the pollen grains moves through the pollen tube to reach the ovule in the ovary at its microbulb. What is the contents? That you should know. What is the contents? Well, what is the contents that is present in the pollen tube? Now, my dear children, what is said to be the pollen tube and what does the pollen tube consist of? Now let us see here. Now pollination stages is there. Now you can see that first, as I said you, the pollen adhesion, hydration and germination starts, and the growth of the pollen tube through the stigma, then style, and then the ovary. So this is the steps through which it passes. Then the pollen tube guidance to the ovule, and it passes through the micropyle. So what is the micropyle? That is the opening of the ovule through which the pollen tube will enter. And the delivery of the, here the meaning of here sperm is nothing but the male gametes. So that please remember here, the sperm is nothing but the male gametes to the embryo sac. Now you please see here, children. Now very important thing. Well, you see here. Now this is the see here L. Well, are you able to see that? Now this is the stigma on which the pollen grain has fallen, and then you can see that the pollen tube is passing through the style. So these are the parts of the carpel. So carpel has got what are the parts? Stigma, style, and then ovary. You must be knowing that. Now the pollen tube, you can see the red color one, that is passing through the style, and then it's reaching the ovary through the thing, it passes and it's entering into the ovule. Are you seeing that? Now this if you are remembering that, very very important is, this pollen tube is nothing but how it is been arising from where it is coming from. So when the pollen grain just falls on this stigma, see here, when the pollen grain falls on the stigma of this particular thing here on the receptacle, now what happens is here, the pollen grain germinates, and we have seen that in megasporogenesis. In the megasporogenesis already we are very clear that that the pollen grain, that's nothing but microspore, has got two cell stage. What are the two cell stage? One is called vegetative cell, another is called generative cell. You remember that? Now only when the pollen grain lands on the stigma, then furtherly it goes from the 2 cell stage to the 3 cell stage, isn't it? That means 3 cell stage of the microsporogenesis. You have been remembering that. Now what is the 3 cell stage there? The vegetative cell is there, which is larger, it has occupied a larger proportion of the cell, and the next is nothing but here the generative cell is there, that is further undergoing some free nuclear cell divisions and forming 2 nuclei set. So they are behaving as male gametes. So the pollen tube is nothing but here the vegetative cell produces a protuberance. You can see the red color one, that is the pollen tube, consisting of the 2 male gametes. So the pollen tube and the 2 male gametes, they all together constitute the male gametophyte. Fine. Now where it is entering here? It is entering into the ovule, and through the ovule it is passing into the, through the micropyle it is entering into the embryo sac. So embryo sac, already you can recall what you can from a previous learning experiences, megasporogenesis. What is that? Do you remember that? It's called 7-celled 8-nucleate embryo sac. So 7-celled, you know that very well how they are distributed. What is that particular whole body is known as? Well, embryo sac. So embryo sac is otherwise called as female gametophyte. Very good. Now, very nice. Now let's move towards the next slide. Now you see here the pollen tube. Now are you able to see here? The pollen tube is entering into the embryo sac. See here very nicely. Here I can see that the pollen grains have been tested on the stigma, and you see that the color of this one, see the pollen tube is elongated, and that is actually the gametophyte. So it's which gametophyte? Male gametophyte, which is having the 2 male gametes. And see here in this picture you can see very clearly that the things have passed here and they have entered here. You see they have entered very clearly, they have passed into the through the micropyle, and see this is the embryo sac. You can see that this is the, well, this is the embryo sac. See that they have entered here, and this is the embryo sac. Now in this embryo sac, I said you, they are the 7-celled stage, isn't it? So 7-celled 8-nucleate stages. So these two, what is these two names? Do you remember that? They are called as pollen nuclei. Very good. They are called pollen nuclei. Very nice. Well, that's called as the pollen nuclei. Very good. Now this pollen nuclei, in which They both will combine and they'll form the secondary nucleus. And towards the micropyle, there's the egg apparatus is there, and the central cell is called egg cell, and flanked by the egg cell we have the synergids. Okay, and there is also filiform apparatus is also there. And opposite to the micropylar end, this is called the chala cell end, right? So you can see the chala cell end is there. They have again 3 cells are there. What is the name of that? So called antipodals. Very nice. So now you can see very clearly the pollen tube is entering here. Now let us see what happens in further one. Now we are coming very close to the subject, that is double fertilization. Now you see here very clearly the embryo sac here. See the 3 cells, that is towards the chala cell end 3 antipodals are there, and towards the micropylar end, so the central part, that's the bigger one, that's called the egg cell, and just the flanking on both the adjacent sides we have the synergids, right? And the central we have the polar nuclei. The polar nuclei will fuse and they'll form the secondary nucleus. You can recall from your 10th standard, right? Now you can see here what's happening here. Very nice, very good. Yes, you can remember here. Now you can see here very clearly that the cells have entered here. This is here you can see the pollen tube has entered here, and that has released the pollen tube will be directed through one of the synergids, and the filiform apparatus also will help the movement of this pollen tube into the embryo sac. Fine, and they release the 2 male gametes. Now what has happened? One of the sperm. So this meaning of the sperm here is nothing but, so this is male gametes. So one of will fuse with the egg. What is that called as syngamy? Okay, we remember from the first chapter. So it forms a diploid cell. So that's called zygote. The another one, 2 polar nuclei. That is nothing but secondary nucleus, and they will form a triploid cell, that's called an endosperm. Okay, so this is what. So since 2 fusions are occurring, that's why it is called as the topic is called as double fertilization. Is it clear, my dear? That's why it is called as double fertilization. Is it clear? Next. Now let us now recapitulation. Now let us see. Now it's a very beautiful diagram is presented for you here. You can see here from here that what's really happening here. See here very clearly. You can see here. Yes. See the pollen has been tested on the stigma. Well, that is the first stage. Adhesion. Now you remember the steps here. So it's accepting. Hydration is occurring. That means germination starts, and then pollen tube is produced inside this. Okay, this pollen germinates on the stigma. The pollen tube begins growing down the style. Right, the long tube structures through which the pollen tube will grow through that. Will try to pass through that. And what's the pollen tube is carrying? Well, 2 male gametes. Very good. Now the pollen generative cell, that's what, divides to form 2 sperm nuclei. There is nothing but 2 male gametes. And the pollen tube completes growth towards the egg cell. And here you can see that the pollen tube has entered here, and one of the thing will fuse with the secondary nucleus, and they will form the primary endosperm nucleus. The primary endosperm nucleus will convert into endosperm. And another male gamete will fuse with the egg cell and form the zygote. Is it clear? So that is what happens here. But now there are some questions for you. Please you have to answer these questions. What is the male gametophyte in the flowering plant? Next question is, mention the cell stage of the microspore germination on the stigma. And the third question for you, my dear children, discuss with the knee diagram the process of double fertilization in the angiosperms. So these are the 3 questions. Please attend to that and come with the concise answers. Okay, children? Right. Well, have a nice day. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.